Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Bengis. I'm NERI's Executive Director, and I'm your host for today's webinar. And I'd like to welcome each of you to a webinar entitled The Impact of Pornography on Children, Youth, and Culture. Before I introduce our presenter, Cordelia Anderson, I want to take a moment to tell you about NERI Press. Our mission here is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. Now, to do that, for many years, we only sold books. But with the changes in publishing and the technology world, we're exploring what it means to maintain our mission, but move towards a broader definition of our work, not solely as a book publisher, but also as a knowledge dissemination organization. With that new goal, over the past years, in addition to our books, we've offered online courses, a free research to practice newsletter, and now most recently, these webinars by some of our internationally recognized authors. We're also offering you CE credits for your attendance at each webinar, and I'll give you instructions a little bit later. Unlike many publishers, each of us at NERI Press is also a professional working with you in the field. And when we work to decide on either the most pressing questions that face us, or the most urgent training needs, or the most desired presenters, we do our work a lot better if we have your input and feedback. So you help to make us better, and we really appreciate that engagement. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and feelings with us. Now, just out of curiosity, I'm going to take a quick poll here and ask, how many of you have participated in a NERI Press webinar before? Now, like National Public Radio, it's the donations of our audience that make this series possible. And like NPR, with your sponsorship, we'll not only guarantee you that you can attend every webinar live, but we'll send you a free gift of two of the most popular books we have, Current Perspectives and Current Applications. So truly, this is a win-win for all of us, and thank you for considering sponsorship. A couple of housekeeping things for you. First, let you know that the PowerPoint has been posted on the NERI Press website, and next week we'll be posting a recording of this webinar as well if you want to listen again, or if you have colleagues that you'd like to have listen to this webinar. Second, when the workshop is over, be sure to close out your account. We'll be sending you an evaluation, and again, we truly would love your feedback. And last, as previously mentioned, for those of you who are interested, we now offer CE credits for psychologists and social workers for all of our webinars. Follow the instructions on the webinar page to take a post-assessment test and purchase your CEs at a very nominal cost. So as with any workshop or training, we have some learning objectives. Our three for today are to clarify the range of definitions related to pornography, review three areas where research shows harm, and discuss the importance of changing the conversation related to pornography. So let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, Cordelia Anderson. Cordelia has been working since 1976 to promote sexual health and prevent sexual harm, including abuse, exploitation, and violence. She authored The Impact of Pornography on Children, Youth, and Culture, and founded the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation. Cordelia is on the board of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and ATSIS Prevention Committee. In 1992, she founded her own training and consultation business, Sensibilities. And here's a copy of Cordelia's book that is available through NERI Press. Now, rapidly changing technology has dramatically changed the reach of pornography, as many of you know, and this booklet offers a deeply researched and shocking overview of the impact of pornography on children and youth. It also provides clear information and resources about what can be done to counter the harm to our children and teens, and offers practical tips about how to focus on and promote sexual and relational health. And with that, I'd like to introduce and welcome Cordelia Anderson.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here now, and I'll go show my screen. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted to have so many people that have shown an interest in this and in NERI's interest in this topic. I am particularly interested in the impact of pornography on children, youth, and culture, and will focus my comments today. Steve already mentioned the goals. I just want to add that, definitions are a charged issue because we don't all agree on what definition should be used, and I'll try to address that a little bit. or the relevance of different research. And by changing the conversation, I really mean, how do we think about this more as it affects our health and our collective public health? You heard a little bit about my professional background. I just want to say that we've each had different journeys to get to where we are or where we might be when we think about pornography. I was actually raised in a home where it wasn't hidden, but rather it was part of my father's head of household, privilege to have it out wherever he wanted. So I didn't have that kind of boundary. A lot of people do, about that, it's adult purview, it's hidden, and you might sneak a look at that. But in my growing up era, that was magazines, that was Playboy. When I was an undergrad, I worked at the program in human sexuality at the University of Minnesota. I got an undergrad clerical job. But it opened up this whole new world, and at that time I was able to be trained as a small group leader, part of the sexual attitude reassessment seminars. They showed pornography as part of those, and very much the frame for it was something that therapists could encourage their clients to watch or use in order to enhance their ability to imagination around sex or to talk about sex. It was used for the professional training to help us talk about sex by looking at the different running screens of pornography. When I left, and I also learned great things about healthy sexuality and the importance of promoting sexual health. And we were just beginning to learn about child sexual abuse, where I then went and focused a lot of my attention, both looking at early studies around those who committed sex offenses, working with victims, and developing prevention programs. In the early 80s, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I am based, Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin really presented to the city an ordinance to look at pornography as a civil rights issue. That got me very much thinking, along with the prevention work of sexual abuse and violence that I was doing, about where the violence was in pornography and a different kind of lens. Over the course of my work, I've also had the chance to work with Professor Gail Dines, who's done a lot of work in this area, and we're currently doing a project together I'll tell you more about soon. So that's a changing journey. That's a changing frame around my lens with pornography. Some of you might have also had a journey, perhaps different, but that you've gone between. Is this healthy? Is it harmful? Is it somewhere in between? What exactly is the it we're talking about? And one of the things that Dr. Dines talks about, including in a new great video, Pornland, that just came out from Media Education Foundation, is pornography. Yeah, it's always been around, but there hasn't always been a porn industry. The corporatization of pornography has happened, and that, along with technology, really changes the game. We don't all agree on what's sexy, which is a good thing. It's good to have a little range, different perspective. That's all good. What's more challenging, though, for us as professionals, is that we also don't all agree on what's harmful or not. And as I said, times have really changed from the 1953 Playboy, although isn't it interesting that 55 years later, in 2008, when Miley Cyrus was depicted in Vanity Fair, that image looks a bit similar to going back to that early Playboy. But times, as Steve mentioned in the opening, really changed with the onset of high-speed internet. Well, a couple takeaways, if nothing else here. Yesterday's pornography is today's mainstream media. When we talk about this, although I'm doing a very shortened version today, it's important to look at the links between hypersexualized mainstream media and pornography, because pornography has very much influenced that. And the pornography industry, whether we like it or not, is our country and a lot of the world's main sex educator of our young people. And because that's having such an effect on how they are learning about sex, gender, relationships, again, mainstream media and pornography, they learn more about it there than from parents and other caring adults. We really have a responsibility to know what it is they're learning and how to counter that. A lot of people talk about this being a major social experiment, an unregulated one at that. But one of the first people I heard talk about that was Dr. Michael Sato. And I think that's a really key point, that we don't know fully yet what all the effects will be. There's emerging research we'll be talking about. But when you Google porn, which is more likely than pornography, what a young person might type in, depending on the time of day, it's going to widely range. But at this particular date that you see at that time, I Googled and got that many results in that amount of time for porn. If you Google teen porn, in addition, that many in that amount of time. Healthy sexuality, you see, came in way behind and took twice as long. And I want to go back to teen porn because between 2004 and 2013, there was actually an increase in the Google searches of teen porn by 215%. Great deal of worldwide interest in teen porn. That comes up as the first or second searched item. Now, defining pornography is a challenge for us because we've got the legal definitions in this country that focus on sexually explicit material intended for sexual arousal. In academic circles, a lot of times you will see terms like VSS, that's newer, visual sexual stimuli, or sexually explicit internet material, with a lot of concern that it's important to be neutral in our language. I would like us to think, though, about that neutral also is saying that then pornography is simply sex. And one of the things I would encourage people to think about is to look at what's happened with child pornography, albeit different. There's a crisscross and blurring of lines, and with child pornography, we use that term in the U.S. Those of you around the world, you likely use the term child sexual abuse images or child abuse images to more accurately reflect what's being seen, which raises the question, is sexually explicit material neutral, or is that also advancing a frame that this is simply about sex and has nothing to do with violence, versus using terminology like sexually exploitive material or sexually violent images or sexually degrading images. Rand Gavarelli does a TED Talks where he, which is very good, talks about his own impact with pornography, and he talks about it's all about men's dominating and subordinating women. It's not about sex or erotica. It's about a gender hierarchy. And for him, he talks about how porn fueled his anger in his thoughts and in his fantasies. I think bottom line is we could do a lot better at separating sexually explicit material, which I don't believe there's a problem with at all, versus pornography, which is far more often violence than having anything to do with sex. And in fact, this study that gets a lot of attention looked at top-rated free pornography films and found that there were 11.5 acts of violence per scene using a perpetrator action scale. 68% of the time that violence was awarded, and rewarded rather, and they were only able to code positive sexual behaviors in less than 10% of that time. So much more violent depictions of violence. And when it comes to children, specifically the impact, kids look at porn for a lot of different reasons. And they look because they want to have fun, they're curious, they certainly in their minds think that this is equated to sex. It's sex, they want to learn about sex, they might be bored, or somebody said, hey, look at this. And there's lots of reasons why they look that make sense. Kids are curious and they are sexual beings. Problem is, once you look, you can't unsee what you've seen, and what they get is very different than what they bargained for. I really like Scal Bente's study back in 2007 that I want to mention, even though it's a bit older, because it was a non-clinical population, and she was trying to study how porn contributes to the construction of sexuality in children and youth. And what she found back in 2007, so it's rapidly increased, is 98% of those boys and girls were exposed by age 12.2. But that particularly children who were exposed under age 10 reported more sexually questionable behavior, more arousal to violence. All of you who do assessment or clinical work with children and youth or do prevention, some of the issues are, did the kids see it by accident? Was it intentional? How much? What type? What was their response? Because certainly not everybody's affected in the same way. It depends on all of those things and what kind of risk and protective factors we each have. But of course, we're concerned about, does that early exposure and use predict future behaviors? Again, it's going to depend how much, what type, what's the response, what's the context. But another study that came out just in 2014 showed that the bottom line, and that was in the Journal of Sex Research, looked at that for children who access pornography under age 11, when that's intentional access, you're usually dealing with sexual sensation-seeking behaviors anyway, and that signaled sexual risk-taking among young adults, both male and female. And Another study, just as a sample of impact, Yarbrough's got different studies that are all worth a look. But the one in 2013 really said 3 in 4 teens attempted or completed sexually abusive acts within the context of romantic relationships. That was really concerning to me, and I'm sure to all of us that have been working so hard for around sexual abuse prevention, with the whole concept of consent and how pornography has a major pushback to that because it really blurs those lines. Yarbrough said, and the other authors, there was no causal relationship, which is often the case. There's a correlate, not a cause, with pornography, but that the results point to the ubiquitous availability of the material being a guide to beliefs and activities. There's a Denmark study that's often cited that also came out in 2013 as showing that there's not much harm. They surveyed 4,600 15 to 25-year-olds, and boys and girls, 88% had access in the last 12 months to pornography. And they only showed what they called a modest association between that exposure and looking and sexually adventurous behaviors, 2 categories, including things like exchange of sex for money. And that was a 0.3 to 4% correlation there. And the issue gets to be, they said the study may be hard for educators and child welfare people to incorporate into their worldview. Those that comes up a lot with studies that don't show harm, or such as that one, in how that was viewed. And yet, I think we've got this issue when it comes back to harm of it's hard for those who see harm maybe to look at that through that lens at other studies, and those that are showing those studies to really look at and integrate the ones that show harm. We have studies at this point showing both. In the UK, about the same time, in 2014 actually, there was a study with another journal that looked specifically at anal sex. Heterosexual, like a lot of these studies are doing an analysis of heterosexual pornography and heterosexual behavior, but they were looking at the practice of heterosexual anal sex. And if not practiced among 16 to 18-year-olds, it was talked about and it was expected. We don't have a lot of baseline studies 10 years ago, but a lot of us certainly believe that that's a significant change, and it's a significant change in part because of the very frequent depiction of not only anal sex, but brutal anal sex, body-altering anal sex that's depicted in pornography. And a lot of those young people also said they knew it was risky if unprotected. They knew that it could be painful, especially for the woman, but that they assumed they must like it because they'd seen images on it where they liked it. And they also, from those same images, normalized the coercion or the pressure. And the relevance of whether it was mutually desired or not just simply wasn't as relevant. They normalized the pain. And that's a theme in a lot of pornography, that pain is depicted as pleasure. So for our children, a lot of them, childhood has gone from Dr. Seuss to porn. And it used to be that if anything, we'd get kind of giggly and really overexcited from holding hands or kissing or hugging. And it's gone from that to the money shots, the body-altering pain, to more and more novelty. And again, it's not the nudity that creates the problems, it's the novelty. It's that clickability, click, 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 and you can get to more and different. And the links to sexting make perfect sense because in this culture, you want to be seen. You don't want to be invisible, and how do you get seen? It's in a hyper-sexualized way in order to get attention or maintain tension. And another study in 2014 in cyber psychology, behavior, and social networking talked about sexting associated with pornography use, and that adolescents who visit more pornography sites were more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, including some of them riskier sexting. This video is actually, I think this came out in Australia. Maybe those of you on here might be familiar with it. I believe the title has changed. It's still in production to The Porn Factor now. But I saw an early review of it, and there was one young man who said, when boys start having sex, they imagine porn. Their dream is that girls can take it and that boys can have their way with girls. I'm sure for a lot of us that are parents, and I have a daughter and a son, and for those of us that work with young people, we do not want our young girls to learn that sex is something they have to learn to take. That they, no matter how painful, no matter how much they want it, there's nothing about mutuality or pleasure, or that one person, whatever your orientation is, can have their way with the person that they're sexually interested in. Another issue is the secondhand factor. This became huge when we were trying to change smoking norms, and this study looked at the fact that even children who are protected from seeing pornography somehow were affected by the attitudes, the behaviors, the expectations, and language of children that were exposed to it. So there's a secondhand effect. And of course, the impact on adults actually also is relevant to children, because we know that the more studies have shown that when parents are more desensitized to different media, that changes what we think is appropriate for our own children and youth. And when it certainly affects our intimacy and our relationships with our adult partners, that can affect the health and well-being of the family. It affects the sexual template of children and youth as they're developing, children, boys and girls, as they're growing up seeing this, but also of adults. Very gendered, in a very binary way, norms. I think it really gets in the way of imagination, because it defines sex in the way that it is very narrowly depicted in pornography. And what's getting a lot of men's attention, young teenagers and young men and men of all ages, is erectile dysfunction. So that's as a result of pornography, and there are many different websites, Reboot, Reddit, NoFab, that are just forums for men to talk about what happened. They were sold a bill of goods that said this is supposed to be good for them sexually, or neutral, if not harmless at best, or a sexual aid, and then finding problems with intimacy and erectile dysfunction. There's lots of studies now coming out, and this is really changing the discussion on your brain on pornography and the effects. Gary Wilson has a very popular TED Talks, Your Brain on Porn, and an excellent new ebook, Your Brain on Pornography, that has really very current research in it. I highly recommend that. And way back, Maltz's book, Porn Trap, really helped us understand how, when we're sexually aroused, dopamine is released. Porn causes a spike in a drug-like high. Other feel-good chemicals, adrenaline, endorphins, serotonin, are released. And porn causes an overload, something that we just can't get that kind of same spike in a real-life situation. It's what's called by other neuroscientists the supranormal stimuli. And it's difficult. It can be difficult for people to get that same kind of stimulation then from a real person. We know from Deutsch's early research that porn creates new maps of arousal. Our brain's malleable and changing. We know from the mirror neuron research that we learn by watching, we experience by watching. We also know from various brain research that whatever the brain does most of, it gets good at, and that Dr. Don Hilton and Valerie in San Antonio, Texas, and Cambridge have both published material that is starting to change the discussion and evidence around links to addiction. So there's an impact, though, also on culture. I mentioned the impact on pop culture, but the huge amount to follow the money with this, what businesses that profit, mainstream businesses that profit from pornography, as well as those that are producers of pornography. There's a lot of normalization of sexual harm that glamorizes pain, that glamorizes that degradation, that plays into very unhealthy and manipulative messages for both for masculinity and femininity and gender norms in general, and creates expectations of children and girls as supply, and really feeds demand for sexual exploitation and abuse. And as Dr. John Breer has said, toxic decisions seem to make sense in a toxic environment. When we've got a hypersexualized, pornified culture, it makes sense to see, in the gendered sense, girls to see themselves as commodities. You want to be seen, that's the way to get valued, and for boys to see themselves as that's what they're supposed to do. Either way, as this interview had said with Joan Angel, the girls come to the set these days almost porn ready. They've learned that this is how they're supposed to act. And as one convicted sex offender that Deb Gildines was interviewing said, the culture did a lot of grooming for me. In reality, it is not only individuals that can groom a child, but a culture that can groom a whole set of children. And that, in fact, industry grooms men. At its core, the pornography industry is men manipulating the sexuality of other men for profit. This is something I first heard from Jennifer Johnson. I was doing research on the literally tracking the industry on the internet and looking at the job of those who profit is to control the flow of traffic, and that dominant traffic is men. And even though the model is now free porn, you can hook people in by free porn, and then you only need a small percentage of them to buy in order to maintain that business model. If this was an adult woman or adult man and a girl, more people would be outraged than seeing a boy. The expectations on our boys are that they are supposed to be ready and wanting, and what's wrong with you if you don't. But it's what's wrong with you as a girl if you don't buy into these supply kind of norms, and what's wrong with you as a boy if you don't buy into that this is how you're supposed to act, is part of the norms we're up against. We're up against also, you need to understand the content and the themes of today's pornography, because you may see it in your cases, and if you don't, you may not know and recognize that it's right out of a porn movie. Some people talk about you can tell how much pornography a person uses by what they want or what they expect sexually. It will be those themes. It certainly is much newer that you'd have a young person expecting or thinking or wanting to have somebody come in their face, the money shot from porn, or rough anal, or gagging oral. These are significant shifts in the themes of pornography. Hearing that, for those of you who aren't used to this, hearing that can be toxic. Hearing that can be very difficult. And very often people talk about the triggers of even talking about pornography, much like the triggers of even talking about abuse or exploitation. But think of what that's like for a child who is just trying to learn about sex or just trying to look up what a body part looked like, and boom, they get multiple screens with that kind of not only language, but imagery, and the power of that imagery and the power of very derogatory, very violent language. So this can be hazardous, and it can be toxic to highly trained professionals who need to look at this for their research or need to look at this because they're investigating a child sexual abuse or exploitation case, a sexual violence case. So this is recognized at places like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children with the incidents that come to the cyber tip line, that they need to have a safety program built in for highly trained professionals that look at that, just as investigators need to have. Now, the good news is there are a lot of actions that are happening around the world, actually some more progressive actions happening in other parts of the world, besides the kind of educating us about pornography, understanding what the research says, trying to look at this as a public health frame, a health frame, and a health impact. There are also political actions and getting us to think not only about education, but also about policy work and who all we have to work with collaboratively to make a change. In the UK, under the leadership of Prime Minister Cameron, there's been a great push to move to opt-in instead of opt-out, meaning that rather than so much of my technology coming with and access to media coming with access to pornography, and then I have to somehow opt out of it or put filters in, that it would be better if it was all blanked out. And then if I wanted it, I'm an adult and I want it, I can opt in. Easy phone call, easy checklist. You still have your right to it. But they tried broader issues, but with pushback from the industry, what they went to was some very creative ways to just try to say a series of ways. I'll just mention a couple of the things they've done to have filters built in by agreement by the main companies, that they would have filters built into their product. So the filters are automatically there. And then if I want my access to pornography to come into my home again, I can opt into it. And they've looked at what they're doing this on mobile phones. They're looking at that in public places. And just looking at a number of ways to make it so that we're not having so much to help kids recover from, but to block access to. There's other ways that we've talked about in this country and other countries. The whole kind of mindset that porn is simply an amenity. It's simply that something we have everywhere, like an entertainment without question in our hotels, for example, and how that might be counter to when we want a sexual violence or domestic violence or child sexual abuse or exploitation conference, that would be in a hotel that's profiting from pay-per-view porn. Well, many hotels are changing their policy after people complained, but also pay-per-view doesn't have the same money anymore because people are bringing it in on their phones, they're bringing it in on their tablets. But I thought it was very interesting that this has received a lot of attention as a potential policy action. And in fact, Nordic Choice Hotels, the owner that owns 171 hotels, went a step further and replaced the pornography that was available in the hotels with art, and made a statement about why it was replaced with art, because he and as a company they were really working against child sexual exploitation commercially, child sex trafficking, and really understood the links between pornography and child sex trafficking, all sex trafficking, so therefore didn't want their hotels to be profiting from it. Iceland, which has gender equity in its constitution, realized that with commitment in the constitution to gender equity, they could no longer really justify strip clubs, recognizing the link to sex trafficking, recognizing treating women as a commodity for males' entertainment, didn't fit with the gender equity in their constitution, and similarly have looked at their pornography policies under that frame. I mentioned in the opening also that another action really around this is a public health frame. I was very excited. This is taking a while, and some of you in other countries, if you've had more success in this, I really hope you're chatting in other states. But in Minnesota, our Department of Health in October sponsored a day-long symposium looking at pornography as a public health issue. I talked about the impact of pornography on children and youth. Jennifer Johnson came in and presented the research on the industry. Don Hilton came in and presented the neuroscience and issues around addiction. We had a survivors panel with a woman who had been pornographically exploited as part of a lot of other violence she experienced as a child. A young woman who at 13 got involved in sexting despite parents who were very educated her, had a very strong link, and another mother whose 14-year-old son got access to pornography and quickly really had a problem staying away from it, and the ripple effects of that in his life and their lives. So listening to that frame and looking at the data, and now we're really looking at follow-up and how do we have more success looking at this as a public health issue. We're also just talking about various ways we can change the frame, change the image of how we talk about this, get away from the frame of morality, or get away from only the kind of debates about is this causal, if then, but rather we understand different correlates. There's lots of new emerging research. We have to look at the links when this is high-speed internet, easy access with exceedingly different content, and what that does. So reframe. If you don't know, there's so many new resources, and I'll tell you about a brand new one I'm working on after this next slide, where we'll try to have more of the resources all in one place. But Fight the New Drug is one that really does a very accessible education for young people, high school and middle school. And Clay Olson, who started that, who I've had the privilege of being with at different places and presenting, does a wonderful job of reaching young people in a very accessible, very engaging way. They talk about porn kills love. They talk about neuroscience, but in a way that just makes this so accessible so that we can really get better attention to how an industry is manipulating their sexuality, much like how that helped the shift with tobacco. They also have the 4 to 5 program online treatment program for young people, which is a really impressive program where kids can go online to get help for what they perceive to be a problem. Very often no adult knows that they're having this problem whatsoever. and they needed a place to go and get support and services. With Stop Porn Culture, Gail Dines, we're going to be launching a new website. I don't have its name yet, and I don't have a link yet, but you keep watching on either my website, CordeliaAnderson.com, and or at Stop Porn Culture. We are working on a free online program for parents so that it will help parents understand the content of today's porn, the reality of the industry, some of these studies and more on the impact on children, how to talk about that, what they need to do when it's affected, resources that are out there when it affects their own lives, their children's lives, and how to get involved more in making a change not only in their own families but broader if they're interested. So I just want to also make sure before we go into discussion that I know that one of the issues as we talk about pornography that is difficult for people is a lot of us are against censorship. We realize that censorship has blocked in many parts of the world us being able to talk about healthy sexuality, to be inclusive of different orientations, of different realities with people, to recognize children and adolescents as sexual beings, to recognize sexuality throughout our lives, to recognize that we're sexual human beings, whether we're sexually active or not, and that we have precious few images that really capture the joy, the heart of sexuality, the mutuality, and that in fact, to me, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is difficult about today's pornography and the plethora of it, the tsunami of it, and the way it's affected mainstream media, is that it really affects our imaginations, and it affects our ability to be playful, have the humor, have the joy, and that intimacy. When I think about something like The Power of a Kiss, in the 70s and 80s, I used to also treat women who had been prostituted, and they talked about, I don't kiss, it's too intimate. And yet that came back to me again recently when in pornography, today's pornography, is you don't see kissing, holding hands, hugging, you don't see human connection, very seldom at all. It's very different than that. So in many ways, to move ahead, to go back to talking about mutuality, to going back to talking about pleasure, we do need a revolution. But that revolution is not one based on shame and blame, but understanding how so many of us are being manipulated by the profit of a few. It's not only the harm on women and children, it's the harm on men. It's the harm on our culture. It's the impact on our health. And that requires us to take back our sexuality from an industry that very narrowly defines it and says to us, this is what you're aroused by, but this is what is produced, and this is what is controlled. And to have a revolution that is a collective change of heart. Many people say to me, well, the cat's out of the bag, man. This is so big. It's so out there. How can we possibly make a difference? And I would say, boy, is that cat ever out of the bag, and it's changed so much in the last 20 years, so much in the last 10 years. But think back not long ago when tobacco was promoted actively, when it was prescribed by doctors as something that would help with anxiety. Doctors had ads out. It was discussed as helpful for anxiety. It was sexy. It was indirectly sold to children because it was depicted in cartoons, and there were candy cigarettes. It was viewed as harmless. The industry knew it was harmful, but they claimed it was not harmful. In fact, it was healthy. It took a long time for science to catch up and work against an industry that was so huge and so profitable and had such an influence on policy. I think in many ways we're at the same place with the pornography industry. But this, going back to the censorship issue, in reality right now, we in many times censor healthy, comprehensive sexuality information. And what's marketed is pornography, sexually violent, sexually degrading images and messages that constantly play into very unhealthy gender norms and hierarchy. So as we go into discussion, I want you to just think about the words of Prime Minister Cameron as he made his speech in 2013 related to his work to opt in instead of opt out. And one of the things he said is we need to get back to the kind of society we want to be. I want Britain to be the best place to raise a family, a place where your children are safe, where there's a sense of right and wrong and proper boundaries between them, where children are allowed to be children. The actions we are taking is to protect the most vulnerable in our society and childhood itself. This is what is at stake, and I will do whatever I need to do to keep our children safe. So as we go into the discussion and we go into the debates, and I only touched on a little bit of the research out, there's so much more research out now and emerging all the time. I just want us to think about how this has changed and whether or not the populations we're working with in either a treatment way or an education way really have a sense of the content and reach of today's pornography and what we need to do to truly and honestly promote relational, gender, and sexual health. And with that, Steve, I'll go back to you to open up for questions.
Cordelia, thank you so much for what is a really thought-provoking and rich presentation. For those of you listening, if you have any questions, please type them in and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Let me start out with something that was sent along, which is just sort of, is the 4 to 5 program an evidence-based program, Cordelia?
Yeah, you know what's really interesting about that's a great question, and it only started in this last year, and they already have, I'm trying to pull up my numbers that I meant to have over 10,000 people, I think, came on in the first 8 months. So in terms of evidence-based, the professionals and the range of people they worked with to create the program, I told you I would turn on my little webcam during this discussion, so let me do that. The professionals they worked with to create it built on all the evidence and research, or the different kinds of research that I talked about. They're evaluating that as they go. They track the progress of the individuals as they go. They're able to check in with them throughout it, their sessions, and they are evaluating as they go. So it's a new program, and I think it relates to probably what a lot of different people are experimenting with, is how to use technology, the incredible, wonderful power of technology for education, for treatment, for outreach in very different ways. I was very hesitant about it when I heard about it, and the more I heard about it, the more I saw their incredible ability to track and monitor participants and encourage them very strongly in order to move along in the program, to make connections with caring adults and to get the other support and resources they need, the more impressed I was. So I really encourage people to check it out.
Well, here's a really large sort of question for you. Why do you think the United States is so far behind in taking a stand on not objectifying women compared to some of the other countries that you mentioned in your presentation?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, I think that when you think about those of us that I've been at this for 38 years, and in terms of my professional work, and I think about the incredible strides we made in the 70s and 80s, and really have made all along. And in some ways, this feels like a pretty orchestrated pushback. A parallel to that would be to look at what happened in women's sports. We had Title IX. We finally had a push for athletic equity. And then what happened, and it's continuing to happen, is that for women athletes, the pressure was on to show that you were feminine and to be depicted in hypersexualized ways in order to get attention, not only for your athleticism. So it's an interesting kind of constant pushback as there is more progress towards equity, a pushback towards objectification and a hierarchy. I think the whole issue of how we value children's rights and how we value women's rights as opposed to those constitutional issues around the world are also part of it. But obviously it's complex. It's a complex issue.
So here's another complex question, which is, other than pornography, given that people want to be aroused, that it's a brain, as you mentioned, endorphins get kicked in, people are looking for erotic material. Is there any place where erotica is being produced that's not pornographic that you can see?
You know, it's interesting. A colleague of mine left work in the child sexual abuse prevention field in the 80s and moved to Alice Ray. We used to be a committee for children, and she moved to San Francisco, and that's exactly what she wanted to do, was make erotica, feminist-informed erotica. And there are people that do that, and there's debates certainly about where that all fits in the spectrum. But I'm a firm, I think I agree that we need to be able to ignite people's imaginations about and realities about healthy sexuality. Well, I'll finish my story about Alice. What she found is it was very difficult to get that funded. It was easy to find funding if she was going to cross the line and have a different kind of production. Much like the music industry, it's very difficult. It's much more difficult to make it as an indie artist who doesn't buy into the norms and depictions of men or women in the industry. And again, across all these lines, there's not only gender limitations, there's a lot of racism that's also part of this. So I think that that's part of what we need, is to ignite the imagination of artists. We did a whole conference here in Minnesota once where we had everybody enter. This was back in 2009. It was a sexual violence prevention. We had college students pull together a lot of images of the normalization of sexual harm, which was very easy for them to do. And we filled a hallway with it. And at the end of the day, we asked them to find images of healthy sexuality. And that was much more challenging for them to find, but they found those. And to just see the difference in the feeling, even though we're so used to the first kind, we hardly see it or notice it, but a completely different feel. So clearly, we need to stimulate more availability so that people can make an informed choice.
So here's a treatment question. Just when you're working with youth, what would be the best methods for addressing sexual health questions that they may have?
Well, I'm on the prevention end of the spectrum, but I think that in having in my past life been more involved in that end, and you can also link to some of the other wonderful resources you have on NERI, an important thing with young people is that we be willing to hear what their questions are, hear what words and actions mean to them, find out what the information is that they need. And when I want to go back to the words, just because I use a word doesn't mean I necessarily mean the same thing you do by that word. So what's that word mean to me? What my question? What meaning do I make of it? What kind of information do I need? And then be able to either help them answer those questions or link them to resources where they can get that information. And very often young people are craving a discussion, I think on a heart and a gut level. A lot, not all, but some young people feel really disturbed or uncomfortable with the pornographic images and feel like they're supposed to think it's cool. They feel like they're supposed to have a different response to it. So sometimes just having a safe space to even raise their questions where they might feel different about that can be very helpful.
So I'm going to try to this is a very long question. I'm just going to take part of it. You mentioned that, pornography in your definition included violence and exploitation, and the writer wasn't sure whether you maintained that throughout the presentation, that is what your images are, but he was concerned about the desensitization that happens over time with some youth that he's worked with that tend to drift towards child pornography as they get bored with adult pornography. Do you find
that is such a good question. That's such a good question. I did try to, normally when I have more time, I spend time just talking about the issue of child sexual abuse images too, because I completely agree with that comment. I believe firmly that there's a blurring of lines between today's pornography and mainstream media and the online, what's called adult legal pornography, and which is legal, and the technically illegal child pornography. That happens in a couple of different ways. It happens by just the sheer volume of teen porn. Again, remember I said that was a number 1 or 2 in the search engines of different studies that have been done about what people look for. So that means that is looking for teens as legitimate sexual objects for your sexual arousal. But when you're on adult porn sites, there's lots of references to incest, there's references to children, there's references that are very graphic, but use different language than they do with women, so that would suggest to users that are just on legal adult porn sites that it is perfectly okay, if not expected, to be aroused by references and images of children, albeit they would allege that those are really over 18, which they're technically supposed to be able to prove. But a lot of times, if you see it, they certainly do not look. They're reportable. I mean, you will hear youth and adults who talk about they were looking at porn and they saw that made them more interested, and they went to child sexual abuse images. This point is that there's a whole lot of people that are looking at child sexual abuse for their own sexual arousal who are not pedophiles, are not sexually aroused only or primarily by children. This is this kind of broader grooming for adults to see children as legitimate sexual objects or commodities for their use.
So I think I'm going to ask you one last question here, and thanks to everybody who sent your questions in, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. If somebody wanted to work on prevention of sexual abuse and exploitation, where would they go? Where can we find out more about the prevention end?
That's a good question. Please look at my website, CordeliaAnderson.com, and be happy to link you to resources. There's also www.preventtogether.org. That's the National Coalition's website. National Sexual Violence Resource Center is another site to go to. In Canada, the Canadian Child Protection Center and several other programs there. I know Australia's got great programs, so check for prevention. There's good things about what we Google and what we can find too, and great resources that are listed at several of these different sites. We encourage your interest, and Steve, I've got to close with, prevention is not only the work of those of us that consider ourselves preventionists. The only way we're going to achieve prevention is if the therapists, the law enforcement, the medical professionals, the faith leaders, the business leaders, etc., understand what their role is in prevention as well. It's going to take us all.
I'd also just put in a plug. There is a prevention source book through Neary Press that someone can also gather an enormous amount of information. That was edited by Keith Kaufman. So, Cordelia, stay with us, and thank you. I'll be doing that a lot more formally in a moment. But just I want to take a moment to let you know that we also put together a monthly newsletter where we look at cutting-edge or controversial research and talk about the findings and the implications they may have to clinicians in the field. So you're automatically signed up for this resource if you signed up for the webinar, and we hope you'll find it useful. You can always opt out. We hope you won't, and we hope that you'll stay in touch with us to let us know what issues you want us to address, and we can have a great discussion pulling this together at our end. So we often do when David Prescott and Joan and I work on that every month. And if you like this webinar, you can see previous webinars on our website at www.nearypress.org. So a word about our next webinar, which is the overview of assessments for sexually abusive adolescents, presented by Phil Rich, who many of you have had the pleasure of attending his workshops, either nationally or internationally. And I really encourage you to attend. It's a webinar that will briefly review the current status of juvenile sexual risk assessment, the empirical basis of current risk assessment instruments, and the role of comprehensive psychosocial assessment in understanding risk for continued sexually troubled behavior. And the webinar, in terms of Phil doing this, will serve as an introduction for a 3-day course that he's going to be leading this spring, that we're going to be hosting, Neary Press will be hosting, that will provide instruction and practice experience in the administration of juvenile sexual risk assessment, scheduled for June 2nd through the 4th in Marlborough, Mass. And for more information, you can visit our website. And we've put in the plug for folks to sponsor, and I don't know if you know this, but a lot more people wanted to be on this webinar than were able to be. So if you're a sponsor, you're guaranteed a seat at the table. I do want to thank our present sponsors, the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM Group, James R. Reynolds, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Maple Tree Group Homes, New Hope Treatment Centers, Rancho Arlo Society, Stevens Treatment Programs, the Wayne County Juvenile Probation Department, Yara Counseling, and the Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling, Inc. I'm happy to read more, so please consider your sponsoring this. As I said, it's your donations that allow us to continue our work here. And if you're interested in being a sponsor, just contact us at nearypress.org on the website or 413-540-0712, extension 14. This is really starting to sound like an NPR infomercial here. And once again, we'll say thank you to you with a copy of current applications and current perspectives. Just so you know, it for individuals, it's $98 a year, and you can attend all of our workshops, and it's $250 for organizations. Just a reminder that the PowerPoint slides are posted on the website, and recording will be posted next week. You'll receive an announcement when it is posted and a link to the certificate of attendance. CE credits are available, so go to the webinar page to find the link for the post-assessment test and a link to purchase your CEs. And please complete the evaluation, and a link will be sent to you when you sign off. So that I got through all that. Thank you for all your patience in listening to it. And Cordelia, mostly a huge thank you. This is just such important work that you're doing. You've been doing it for years. People I think of this a little bit as the football debate. People love something that it's time to take a hard look at, the damage that it's doing to children, to women, to the people who are involved in it, all of it. So, you're raising consciousness and you're doing great work out there. Thank you so much for presenting this webinar. And once again, to all of our audience, we really appreciate your feedback. I once again apologize for all the questions I couldn't get to. There were some excellent ones. And thank you very much. And we hope to see you next month in our next webinar.
Thank you.